特朗普的关税战打到中美商贸硬脱钩，咱们看到了，现在一说中美关系都知道紧张。这个节骨眼啊，我们反而得多交流，也得听一听来自美国的声音。所以啊，我们就联系上了曾经处理美国对华关系的资深参与者罗伯特·佐利克。他呢是小布什政府时期的贸易代表，在他任内，中国完成了加入 WTO 的最终谈判。在之后，05年他又出任副国务卿。这张抱熊猫照也是中美关系的一个美好的瞬间。07年，他去世界银行执掌了5年，任命了中国经济学家林毅夫，成为了第一个来自于发展中国家的世界银行首席经济师兼资深副行长。那么前段时间，他的新书《论美国》上市了，就是在聊外交。今天啊，咱们就和他聊一聊他眼中的特朗普、美国外交和中美关系的未来。
This is Albert, and I have finished reading your book, and this book walked me through the American diplomatic history again and making me feel going back to school. So based on this book and the current affairs, I'm very, very excited about the conversation we're going to have today. And first, the question, Trump, unavoidable topic. So I would very much love to know how American people see this matter, especially the policy researchers, entrepreneurs, and government officials you have engaged with view this super tariff.
I think people are uncertain and somewhat confused by President Trump's tariff policies. On the one hand, he's been talking about tariffs since the 1980s. So people expected that he would either seek increases or negotiations, but they were surprised by the size and the type. And you can see that in the reaction of various financial markets, which is continuing through this week. I think people in his administration and Trump himself have used different explanations. Sometimes they say it's for negotiations. Sometimes they say it's to raise revenue. Sometimes they say it's for compel action on non-economic issues like fentanyl or illegal immigration. Sometimes they say it's to compel investment in the United States. Sometimes they say it's for protect existing industries. As you probably know, there are three different types. One is a sort of a baseline 10%. Then there's tariffs that he's developing for particular sectors. And then there's so-called reciprocal tariff, which really isn't a reciprocal tariff. It's focused on the nature of the bilateral trade deficit. So based on the negative reaction, some people in the administration have talked about moving to negotiations, but you have lots of countries and it takes a long time to do those. In the case of China, I think what you partly have is he responded partly to how other countries reacted. And so if other countries suggested they're willing to negotiate or meet various terms, then he at least suggested that there may be changes. How much, we don't know. It's a period where it could go in different directions, and it obviously adds costs for everyone. I think whether in dealing with China or within the U.S. or with other countries, Trump likes uncertainty. He views the world as a deal maker. He thinks that deals are made by top-level people. He seems to believe that he can use the uncertainty to his advantage. In the world of business and investment, it often doesn't work that way. People need some degree of confidence about the future for making investment or consumer purchases. And so you see that rippling through the U.S. economy and other economies as well. So this is a grand experiment. The U.S. hasn't conducted policies like this for 70 or 80 years. And we'll see what happens. Obviously, I'm not a fan of it, but I'm not in charge either.
Thank you very much. So let's go back to your book. In your book, you have proposed 5 traditions of American diplomacy. So with the 4th, you especially emphasize the public and congressional support is the foundation of policy legitimacy. Well, in 2016, Trump only won electoral vote, but this time he won both popular and electoral vote. Republicans now have the House and the Senate under control. In the Supreme Court, the conservatives outnumber the liberals. Well, this political foundation has made public support a shield for his unilateral policies. but at the cost of a severely in the other four traditions, for example, the trade. Do you think we still have these five traditions? Are they broken?
So to start, Albert, I view the electoral results a little differently than you described. Trump won quite narrowly, and in the House, the Republicans barely hold a majority. So I think it's more accurate to say that while he won and the Republicans won, it's a divided country on these issues. I think many people were frustrated with Biden's policies. They didn't like the inflation. They felt the border was under the loss of control, which no country can accept for long. And there was a reaction to what's in the U.S. called the woke agenda, some of the cultural issues. So I think that's the reason that that Trump won. As I mentioned, I think people knew that he might take tariffs as a policy, but I don't think they expected exactly what we're seeing. As for the courts, too, the U.S. system is different than China's. So courts now have more conservative justices at the Supreme Court level. They're not just going to follow what Trump says. They're going to try to read the law as best they can. So that's one of the tension points that you see in our sort of daily news. As you suggest, in some ways, the five traditions give you a pretty good roadmap but in a negative sense. So, for example, I talk about the importance of North America. Well, Trump is focusing on North America, but in a very different way than Ronald Reagan did or the Bushes did or that I would have. He's basically in controversy with Canada and Mexico.
It's not for sale, won't be for sale.
Never say never. Never say never.
I talked about trade, transnationalism, and technology. Well, that's certainly on the agenda, but Trump's approach, again, is different. I talked about the importance of alliances and how the U.S. was hostile to alliances for our first 150 years. Then we embraced alliances. Trump seems to be ambivalent and maybe even negative because he feels that the U.S. is borne too heavy of a burden. You then mentioned the public appeal, and we'll see how that plays out. So if I look, for example, at some of the recent polling data, Gallup did a poll about whether Americans feel trade is a positive for growth or a negative, and 81% feel it's positive and 14% feel it's negative. So the numbers have actually gone up since Trump. So we'll see how that works. In some of the international issues, it's undoubtedly the case that many Americans just want to go on with their life. They're tired of dealing with issues around the globe. So these are the type of questions that are still depend ultimately on performance. And we're pretty early in terms of administration. So, normally in democratic systems, there's a self-correction if people go too far or if they make mistakes. But that depends on whether you accept the results of elections. And I think the part of President Trump that concerned people the most is sometimes when he lost the last time, he tried to deny the result of the election. That's a fundamental issue for democratic societies.
And also, you mentioned that 2024 election, the Democrats lost because people are also frustrated with Biden's policy. And we can see that when Biden replaced Trump in 2021, he did not repeal many of Trump's, I would say, confrontational policies. He didn't even revive the suspended WTO appellate body. So, I can understand the logic of the U.S.-China competition and why that the United States is having a confrontational policies to China. But I'm very curious why the United States undermines the very international institutions that the U.S. itself established after the World War II, which can ensure its global leadership.
For a Chinese audience, in some ways, there's some similarity in that most Americans are trying to get on with their jobs, their families, trying to deal with their elderly relatives, their healthcare. They're reluctant internationalists. The U.S. is a big country, not as big as China, but it's a big country. And if you travel it, as you might have done, most people aren't trying to run the world, whether in Asia or Europe or Latin America. They're just going about their business. But what happened, as you pointed out, after World War II, people felt they had to learn the lessons of the 20s and 30s, where they didn't deal with the security and economic problems after World War I. So the U.S. led in creating this system for both security and economics and multilateralism. With the end of the Cold War in 89-90, then enlarged the system because in some ways, the world market economy in 1989 consisted of about 1 billion people. with China and the end of the Soviet Union and the various developing countries, it grew to about 5 or 6 billion people. Well, not surprisingly, that was going to be disorienting and displacing. And as you know, there were various debt and exchange rate financial crises. Because this is an open society, when people got frustrated, whether with the global financial crisis, with long wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, with the pandemic, and so Trump was able to come in the 2016 election, in a sense, to try to take advantage of the fact that people were discontented and they wanted a change. As you pointed out, Biden maintained a number of the tariff policies. I personally thought that was a mistake, and I argued against it because I thought Biden would never be able to compete with Trump on negative descriptions of the economy. I mean, Trump can get hyperbolic, he goes over the top in his explanations. Now, Biden added a different approach. He added some big subsidies for various sectors, and drawing from the experience of the recovery under President Obama after the global financial crisis, I think he expanded the fiscal side too much. They thought that the recovery in the 2000s under Obama was too slow, but they spent too much money and they helped trigger an inflation, which was very unpopular. And frankly, as I said, Biden was trying to compete with Trump for union workers, manufacturing sectors, and others. Ultimately, I think that was a mistaken approach. There's a bigger story here that relates to both the United States and China, which is that inevitably, as economies grow and adapt to change, it's disorienting for people. So there's big discussion in the United States about manufacturing and reindustrialization. But many Americans don't recognize that the manufacturing output in the United States actually exceeds that of Germany, Japan, South Korea, and India combined. It's second only to China. So what that means is there's fewer workers in manufacturing, but they're more productive. They're paid more. Over the first 20 years of this century, U.S. manufacturing exports actually doubled. From 1975 to 2025, so 50 years, the percentage of workers in the manufacturing sector, or manufacturing as a percentage of workers, went from about 22% to about 8%, but their production was 2.5 times larger. So this is an inevitable process if you're going to move up the productivity chain. And you'll see this. I visited the BYD plant in Shenzhen, and everything's run by robots. So the joke in Shenzhen was there's robots and a people and a dog. And the dog is to protect the robots and the person is to feed the dog. My own view is that Trump is trying to turn the economy back to the 1950s as opposed to forward. So I don't think it's going to work.
So, but what do you think of Stephan Mills' agenda? He is accusing that the American dollar's value being the major problem. He's saying that American dollar is being too expensive, and so American customers see foreign goods to be too cheap, and the foreign markets see American-made goods to be too expensive. He keeps saying that this is the biggest problem leading to the huge trade deficit.
So since 1971 and the move from fixed exchange rate to flexible exchange rates, the value of the dollar has sometimes gone up and sometimes it went down. So I was at the Treasury Department in the late 1980s with Secretary James Baker. The value of the dollar was very high. And when the dollar is very high, or if your currency is very high, it increases the imports because people can buy more because their dollar goes further. But it means that their exports are more expensive. So it tends to lead to a trade deficit. So the type of comments you hear about an overvalued dollar relate to the Trump concern for trade deficits. Now, in the late 1980s, Baker and the Reagan administration approached this cooperatively with the G7. They were able to lower the value of the dollar while promoting open trade. That's an important difference. What you now have is people in the Trump administration who seem to want to lower the value of the dollar, but also be protectionist. And that undermines the confidence in the system. Now, if the dollar has a lower value, you create a different problem, which is that all of a sudden then will people invest in your securities, particularly if you're running deficits, whether budget or sort of trade deficits. And you've seen some of that happen over the past couple of weeks. The value of the dollar has come down. Now, the dollar might have been overvalued, but that will increase the costs for, say, interest on your debt. And so generally in a market economy since 1971, people have allowed the supply and demand for the currencies to reflect it. But sometimes it gets overvalued, sometimes it gets undervalued. So what you described with at least some people in the administration is that their view about a lower dollar is consistent with their desire to lower the trade deficit. But as I've suggested, it can create other problems. So in general, in the past, kind of countries have learned that if you want to try to adjust the currency accounts, then it's best to try to do so cooperatively, because it's also linked to your monetary policy. If your currency loses too much value, to try to restore it, you have to raise interest rates. Well, raising interest rates doesn't help your overall economy. So it's part of what we're discussing is kind of the big shifts that I'll call in Trump's international economy. And we'll see how it works out. I'm skeptical.
So can we say that since you have also mentioned the problems that the Democratic administrations created, so can we say that it is not Trump who made all the problems for the United States, but all the American problems made Trump?
Well, it's a question of which came first, the chicken or the egg, I guess. So it's a democratic society. People can choose. As I explained, there are various courses of frustration. On the other hand, many people in the world would have looked at the U.S. economy and would say, well, why are you complaining? The U.S. was growing much better than Japan or Europe. The innovation and technology here is world class. But as I mentioned, sometimes people have a difficulty adapting to change. So one of the big topics in the U.S. is the so-called China shock. And what they're referring to is the fact that when China came into the World Trade Organization, while the U.S. didn't lower its barriers, it committed to maintaining them. And so many foreign investors came into China. They built factories for export. And the Chinese exports to the United States increased very quickly. And for some industries, that made it hard for them to adapt. And so people lost their jobs. Traditionally in the U.S., people would have moved and they would have gotten jobs in new activities because the economy keeps changing. Many of these people didn't. And maybe they were older, maybe they didn't want to leave their houses. And so a lot of these people got left behind. And so that's a big source of frustration that actually fuels some of Trump's interest in reindustrializing. So this is the nature of an adapting market economy, operating in a world economy. And the primary lesson is you have to help people adapt to change. Now, then you have other factors, as I mentioned. So while many people around the world may feel that the United States wants to play a major role internationally, as I suggested to you, for many Americans, it's a burden. It costs. It costs billions of dollars to try to help people in Africa with HIV/AIDS, or to try to deal with the energy security in the Middle East. And so you're partly seeing a pullback from that. Now, we'll see what happens. So just to take a case that's important to China, the U.S. has provided a security umbrella for its allies, including nuclear protection. So in South Korea or Japan, or many in Europe, rely on the U.S. nuclear deterrent. So if the U.S. security relationship with South Korea weakens, you can already see that 70% of the people in South Korea want to have the nuclear weapon. Well, if South Korea develops a nuclear weapon, and North Korea has a nuclear weapon, and Russia has a nuclear weapon, and China has a nuclear weapon, what do you think will happen in Tokyo? So what I'm describing, and by the way, you'd see, I think, movement for nuclear weapons in the Middle East. So in the 1960s, experts predicted many more nuclear weapons powers by now. But that didn't happen, in part because the U.S. offered this security guarantee. If that changes, well, we may see more nuclear weapon countries, and that, in my view, increases risks. So the system is in turmoil, and the international order is in flux. And at some point, your generation will have to figure out what comes next.
You had World Bank for 5 years, and you promoted participation of developing countries. But nowadays, there are still people complaining about IMF and World Bank to be somehow a rich country club. Now, de-dollarization is accelerating, and emerging economies are demanding like a bigger voice in international politics and international stage. So, what kind of reform does the international institutions that they can do? And when you were leading the World Bank, did you ever feel like powerless to see what's going on in the world?
This is an important issue because in this more conflictual global environment, the multilateral institutions have a role to play. Now, keep in mind, they're ultimately run by the countries themselves. So they can't be totally independent of the countries. But on the other hand, sometimes they can provide a neutral ground. They can bring expertise. In the global financial crisis, the World Bank and the IMF stepped in to try to help avoid some of the damage, particularly for developing countries. And so the issue that you allude to is voice and representation. In my time, and today, many people focus on the votes. Now, but this is, if you think about it, this is tricky. So how do you determine the votes? Is it the size of your economy? In the World Bank, for example, every 3 years, the World Bank has to raise money for the International Development Association, IDA. And as you may know, those are grants or long-term loans without interest. Well, most of those monies come from developed countries, not from developing countries. So if you want, and the Nordics, for example, have been very gracious. So the Nordics aren't a big part of the world economy, but they contribute an awful lot to the IDA funds. So do you want to try to make sure they've got votes in a chair? So the way I tried to deal with this is I managed to negotiate some increased voting power for China, and China was very cooperative. Interestingly enough, if it was based on the size of the economy, the Africans would have lost out. So, because the US, for example, has stayed about the same size of the global economy. But in reality, the World Bank and the IMF rarely vote. So the votes are quite symbolic. So what I did was a couple of alternatives. One, I added another chair for Sub-Saharan Africa. So that gave more direct representation. Second, most of the decisions are going to be made by the executive team running the World Bank. So I made a push to bring in more people from the developing world into senior positions and women. So by the time that I left, over half the senior positions were held by developing countries and over half were women. That wasn't easy. I had to really try to push the system. As you probably know, I appointed the first chief economist from the developing world, Justin Lin from China, now at Peking University. And I thought it was a good idea to have a chief economist who'd come from the developing world. But another step was really, how does the World Bank conduct business? So I tried to treat the developing countries as clients. In other words, we're not trying to come up with textbook solutions. We're trying to use the knowledge and learning of development from different countries, and you have to adapt it to the circumstances. The problems of Ghana are very different than the problems of Laos, and so, or other parts of the world. And so you can expand knowledge and learning from different parts of the world. The Chinese growth model was one. There's other types of models that have worked. The key, in my view, to working more closely with developing countries was to try to understand their problems and work with them on their problems and treat them as clients. So ironically, much of the debate is on the votes. The votes don't matter. It's more the people that you got running the World Bank, and I tried to bring in more developing country people. Interestingly, for some countries like Saudi Arabia, I couldn't pay for them. The compensation in Saudi Arabia was too high for what I could pay for. So interestingly, I could bring in some Saudi women because Saudi women weren't as integrated in the workforce at that. And it is a similar challenge for the IMF. The IMF has a slightly different structure, but it's the same need. And the one other caution I'd make, if you think about the first part of our conversation, we were just pointing out some of the risks if the U.S. withdraws from international responsibilities. So I don't want the U.S. to withdraw. So be careful about saying, having developing countries say to the U.S., oh, you're too dominant, because fine. Many Americans will say, have it. We'll go off and we'll do our own thing. And that would not be good. And one other observation on this for people interested in economics. When I came to the World Bank, there was a view that because we're a bank with financial resources, we should focus just on the poorest. I saw the bank as doing more than lending. I saw it as a knowledge and learning exercise. So I wanted to work closely with middle income countries as well as poor countries, in part because I didn't want the multilateral system just to be the rich developed countries and the poor countries. I wanted the middle income countries like China or Brazil or some in Southeast Asia to assume responsibilities in the system, because a lot of the issues of the future, like climate or pandemics or international trade and capital systems, will only be worked out if you've got the middle income countries as part of the issue. And as you know, this is one of the big challenges for China. Before I left, we did a report with China, with the DRC, the Development Reform Commission, on China 2030. What challenges would China have to move from middle income to high income? And just last year, the World Bank did another report on the challenges of the middle income trap. So this challenge is that you can grow with certain productivity gains up to 10 or 11,000 US dollars per capita a year. It's about what China is. But to get to the higher levels, it's a different set of challenges. And in my view, the world is better off if you've got more countries that are growing more and higher incomes, and they'll trade and invest with others. But that's the system now that is being sort of fractured and fragmented.
You talked so many things about China, because I wonder your position on the U.S. and China relations, because you have a very famous picture of holding a panda in China. And most of the Chinese people can still remember that picture. And that reflects a very quite relatively more friendlier relations between the U.S. and China. But you have challenged that China should be a more responsible stakeholder. Well, on the other hand, in recent years, you also have mentioned that the American people should accept China as it is. So in your interaction with the Chinese people, do you feel that they have like some misjudgment about Americans, or what are Americans really like for this crucial point of time? Should Chinese people learn and accept Americans as they are?
That's a good way of phrasing it. You think about the growth in China. This is something that people could see with their own eyes. People in 1980, were extremely poor. It's when I first visited China, everybody was just wearing gray and blue, and the air was terrible. And so on the one hand, great respect for what's been accomplished. And when I was with the World Bank, I was able to visit many parts of China beyond Beijing and Shanghai, including your home province of Hainan. And one of the things that impressed me was that people were willing to work very hard, and they just wanted a better life. So that's one part of the story. But another part of the story that I've also discovered with Chinese officials is because in their own lives and careers, China has grown so much, they still sometimes perceive China as a weak developing country, because in their memory, China at one time was poor. And so when you're a big, powerful country, you have to be a little careful how you treat others, because you don't want to come across as a bully. You can see this in the case of the U.S. So I think Trump acts in ways that probably hurt the U.S. image abroad. When I was representing the U.S., I tried to use U.S. power, but with restraint. And try to be attentive to the perspective of others. So part of what we're encountering here is in the U.S., some people are now a little scared of China. And so sometimes then they pull back, or then they react. And then in the case of the U.S., if the U.S. looks threatening to China, then China feels threatened. Okay? It becomes a downward spiral. And so where I conclude on this is that both sides, as well as other people, while recognizing we have different political systems, need to step back and recognize at a minimum, we need to avoid steps that get into conflict or miscalculations that get into conflict, as has happened in history. And even better, try to find some of the common interests that we need to pursue. But to do this, you have to have trust. And in my era, I was able to work with many Chinese leaders. I dealt with more of the economic technocrats than people on the security side, obviously. And we were able to come up with these ideas on how to help our countries, but also the international system. And that brings us to your question about my speech in 2005 about China as a responsible stakeholder. So I was partly trying to recognize China's accomplishments, but to caution China, to say this international system has helped China advance incredibly since 1980. But somebody has to bear the responsibilities of the system. And in a way, my warning has come true. If you look at the speech closely, I was urging China to help assume the responsibilities because I was afraid if it didn't, the American public would grow tired. Well, the American public's grown tired. And so now we're seeing the system come apart. So my conclusion is, frankly, neither country is acting like a responsible stakeholder today, which is not good for the international system. And that's why we've got some of the fragmentation. Now, can we turn that around? I mean, what's the alternative? And this goes back to your concluding point about Americans accepting Chinese for what they are and Chinese accepting Americans for what they are. I worry about the lack of contact between the two societies. When I've been in China, and obviously you've studied abroad, it's very good for people to visit other countries, meet the people, understand what they're about, recognize differences, but also understand that the other people are human beings. When I was in Shanghai recently, I could see Shanghai was a very different city than the one that I had been to 10 years before. And yet, on the other hand, I'm troubled when the U.S. makes it harder for Chinese or others to come to the U.S. or for Chinese students to come. So we need to keep the contacts. And one reason that I'm talking to you and others is to sort of demonstrate you can agree with me or disagree with me, but we should hear one another's questions and views. So thanks for giving me the opportunity.
Right, great. Thank you very much. And so the last question is that from reading your book, you stopped at the Bush administration. So I wonder how you will define the 21st century, or what should the younger generation of China and the United States learn from the first quarter of the 21st century?
So one reason I wrote the book, and as you properly identify, it's not a memoir. It's a history, but it covers some 200 years. But I do add insights from my experience about negotiations and how things are done. And there's a little bit at the end about my experience in 1989-90 with Germany. But the reason I wrote the book was that when I worked on policy, I often drew insights from history. And as you probably know, because you probably studied foreign policy, many foreign policy courses are now taught using international relations theory. And scholars like theories. But in my experience, those theories were fun to debate, but they were almost useless when it came time to deal with real problems, okay? So I was trying to help a younger generation learn how to think about history in shaping policy. Now, Henry Kissinger wrote a book titled Diplomacy in the 1990s that also drew upon history. But given his background, he tended to focus on the European experience. So the purpose of this book was to focus on the American experience. And while it's about the United States, as you read the book, you'll see it's also about negotiation, mediation, putting together coalitions, arms control, science and technology. I tried to design it so that it would be of more interest to also an international audience. And in discussing those issues, you know, there are non-American figures that I draw in that I find particularly interesting. So in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-05, Count Witte is the Russian negotiator. They're on the losing side. but he does a very good job. And he's criticized back in St. Petersburg. But frankly, I think he did a pretty good deal. I talk about British and French negotiators. I talk about some of the Chinese leaders in the 1920s going up to sort of Zhou Enlai. Japan is an interesting case in the 20s where there was an attitude in Japan about becoming more of a commercial power as opposed to military power. That breaks down in the late 20s, and you have Japanese militarism and the invasion of. So what I've always found that they like stories about people. And so rather than write a dry history text, I tried to write stories about people, and I hope people can learn from them. So coming back to your question about kind of the future, well, that's for you and your generation to determine. You know, I've had my shot. I tried to do the best I could. And so in a small way, I'm trying to leave some insights from my experience. Now, there's one other point for a Chinese audience, which is I've always found it useful to try to understand the history of other countries. You obviously want to learn your own history, but if I'm dealing with Britain or France or Germany or China, it's useful to know a little bit about the history of the other country, at least enough to ask questions. Okay, now China has a very long, complex history, but I'll give you one example. So I was talking about this with some both Americans and Chinese. The May 4th movement. The May 4th movement arrives out of, after World War I, Chinese students reacting against the decision in Versailles to give Shandong over to the Japanese as opposed to the Germans that had. And as you know, this is the early Republican period. There's a May 4th movement. The students go to the streets. Interestingly, what you'll see in that book is this was very unpopular in the US as well. One of the reasons that the Congress rejected the Versailles Treaty is they didn't like the idea of giving Shandong to the Japanese. And so in the 1920s, part of that negotiation in the Washington Naval Conference was actually to get China more authority back over Shandong and have the Japanese pull out some of the authority. So, you know, many Americans would not have any sense of the history of the May 4th movement, what it means in China, and sort of the role of young people against established authority. But, and similarly, of course, in Chinese history, the role of imperialism. So the century of humiliation and how that drives Chinese thinking, you know, and even going back to your question. So while many of the world sees China as a powerful country, some of the Chinese leaders say, well, for 150 years, we were treated badly. And so now we're going to show that we're strong. And so don't try to push me around. And so my point is, I found it useful to learn about other countries' histories. I still try to learn it. I read a book recently about India's history after its independence. It was very informative because it's hard to find books just on, you can find books on India before independence, not so much after independence. So maybe in this way, people can understand a little bit more about the American experience, good and bad. And that goes to your point about having societies at least understand each other a little better.
Very well said, sir. Very well said. So actually, every historical figure you wrote and you mentioned in your book, they had their own youth and they had their education, they had their childhood. And yes, as you say, that we should learn our history, and as the younger generation for now, we should also write the history for the future generation. So we should figure out what to do. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for sharing your view, and thank you again for bringing us this book. You have a nice day.
Good luck, and I hope you build a better world.
好，以上就是今天的采访内容。我相信一些朋友肯定会对佐利克的一些观点并不完全认同，但是他作为一个前美国正部级官员，自然不可能否定美国的前途和体制。交谈的目的咱们不是辩论，不是为了把老头给辩倒，而是去了解对方在想些什么。世界上的人和利益集团千奇百怪，我们未来在走出去的过程中，要和各种各样的人打交道，只有了解了对方，才可以找到共处的方法。但是有一点我非常赞同，他最后提到理论在实践中往往毫无意义，我们需要从历史中给未来找答案。那么 论美国》这本书已经上市了，如果大家感兴趣，也可以在评论区点击链接进行优惠购买。今天就聊到这里，希望我们可以一起学习，超越情绪，找到看世界的角度，用一种更加理性乐观的态度去拥抱多极化的世界。如果您觉得有所收获啊，请关注、点赞、收藏，让更多朋友看到我们的内容。如果您有多一点点了解这个世界，来播变得更强，记录下这一刻。祝大家变得更强，我们下次再见。